Hello, everybody. Hi, my name is Amalia Weber. I'm the program specialist here at Rochester Hills Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you to this evening's program, Albert Kahn in Europe, the Freehand Drawings. Before we get started, I'd like to take care of a few housekeeping details. Firstly, tonight's program will be recorded and available to view about 1 week from tonight on our YouTube page and on the RHPL website shortly after. We ask the audience members please silence or turn off their cell phones before we begin in order to avoid any disturbances during the presentation. We'd also like to thank the Friends of the Rochester Hills Public Library and their many fundraising efforts. It's thanks to their support that we can provide wonderful programming like tonight's presentation. Our next program is a screening of the documentary Many Passages of Time, a story of Indian Muslims in America, which will be an in-person event on Thursday, September 14th at 7 p.m. You can sign up for that at calendar.rhpl.org. Author, photographer, and architectural historian Dale A. Carlson was born and raised along the northeastern shores of Lake Michigan, where, as an adolescent, he developed a fascination with the city of Detroit. Throughout the 1990s, Mr. Carlson studied art, journalism, and graphic design at 4 Michigan colleges, including Michigan State University, while simultaneously migrating closer and closer to the metro area. In 2004, he made Southeast Oakland County his permanent home, and in 2019, he earned an associate degree in photographic technology from Oakland Community College. He serves on the City of Berkeley's Historical Committee and is the author of Corrado Parducci, a field guide of Detroit's architectural sculptor, Kahn's Detroit, a field guide to Albert Kahn designs of the metro area, and Stained Glass New Orleans, a field guide. Mr. Carlson lectures regularly on the architectural history of Detroit and the state of Michigan for a variety of public libraries and historical societies. He credits his late wife, Carolyn Venegas Jones, whom he married in 2015, for inspiring his ventures into publishing and photography. Without further ado, please welcome Dale Carlson.
Thank you. I think I got it on.
Okay.
Are we rocking? Let me make sure I got a good connection here before, how did Jesse Owens' birthday just come up for me? Oh, there it's gone. All right, so hi everyone, I'm Dale Carlson. Thanks so much for coming out tonight. This is a wonderful audience and larger than I usually get for one of my lectures, so I really appreciate you being there. By a raise of hands, who knows who Albert Kahn is and is slightly familiar with his career? Awesome, glad to hear it. Well, I am the author of Kahn's Detroit, a field guide to Albert Kahn designs of the metro area that I first published in January of 2022. I'll probably do a second edition in the next couple of years. And my next book to come out, hopefully within the calendar year of 2023, it's going to be entitled Kahn's Europe, the Freehand Drawings of Albert Kahn at the University of Michigan Museum of Art. And the University of Michigan Museum of Art holds 276 of these drawings, and they've given me permission to edit them as I see fit and include every single one in the book. And I'm extremely humbled by their willingness to let me expound on it and also use the images in our lecture tonight. I hope you'll forgive the appearance of the lecture. We're working from a PDF because we had a little bit of a technical issue coming in, but I feel like our video is pretty decent. Before I get going, I want to thank the Rochester Hills Public Library for inviting me to present tonight, and Amalia Weber, our host, who did most of the logistical work putting together our event tonight. I'm going to break down tonight's lecture into 4 simple parts. I'll start with a bio of myself and how my Kahn book came about. We'll do a small bio of Albert Kahn for those of you that don't have a wide knowledge of how he achieved prominence in the field of architecture and became influential worldwide. We're going to look at 20 European sites he visited and made sketches in while visiting Europe over the course of his 6 trips there between 1890 and 1927, and we'll finish it off with a Q&A. So let's start off with a bio of myself. My interest in the local area and the state's architectural history, it begins when I leave my boyhood home of Traverse City in 1992 to attend school at Michigan State University in East Lansing. And back then I had a lot more hair. And one of my favorite things to do back then was to drive to the city of Detroit every weekend to take in the city's burgeoning house and techno music scenes that were super groundbreaking and super influential at that time. And as a bright-eyed youth visiting Detroit regularly for the first time in my life, I was definitely impressed by the size and scale of the structures I was seeing, and architectural history. It became a hobby of mine for about 15 to 20 years. I started taking it a lot more seriously in 2012 when I met through online correspondence a fellow by the name of Einar E. Kavarin. He's Icelandic by descent, which accounts for his slightly uncommon first name. Excuse me for a second. Oops. And Einar, he lived in the Detroit area through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And he's an architectural historian too. And he revealed to me after I got to know him for a few months, that in the 1990s he hunted down the son of an architectural sculptor by the name of Corrado Parducci, who worked out of Detroit from 1924 to 1981. And Parducci's son allowed him to photocopy his father's original Detroit ledgers, studio ledgers, and also a scrapbook containing over 700 images of sculpture that Parducci created over the course of his career. Well, once Einar told me about these resources, the gears of my mind began clicking, and I immediately decided that I wanted to write a book about Parducci. He's a really well-known figure in the annals of Detroit architectural history. No one had written a book about him, and I felt a responsibility to do something epic with the research materials that had just fallen into my lap. Took me about 7 years, but in January 2020, I released my first book. You'll find it on the counter over here. I have copies of it for sale tonight if you like. Corrado Parducci, A Field Guide to Detroit's Architectural Sculptor. Followed it up with a second edition in May of 2020, and I'll probably have a third edition in the next year or two with about 15 more sites added. Well, that book really got me warmed up and really helped me develop a love for book writing, and I followed it up with 2 more books that I published 2 years later in January and February of 22, respectively. The first was Kahn's Detroit, and the second one was A Field Guide to Stained Glass in the city of New Orleans, a place that I visit quite a bit. So that gives you just a little bit of info about how I developed my expertise in the area of architectural history. And over the course of writing those books, I really learned just an absolute ton about finding the right resources and the right people to be able to really solidly back the factual assertions I make in the book about the art and the architectural detail that we discuss. How's it going tonight? All right, so that's my bio. Let's move on to Albert Kahn now. Albert Kahn is born in 1869 in Raunen, Germany. This is a town about halfway between Luxembourg and Frankfurt. And he spends the first 6 years of his life there with his family. He's the eldest of 8 children. They immigrate to Echternach, Luxembourg in 1875, where they stay another 6 years. And then in 1881, with about half of the 8 children in the family born, they immigrate to the United States. Around the age of 14, maybe 15, he takes a job with the local firm of Mason and Rice. And one of the namesakes of the firm, George Mason, becomes a lifelong mentor. And this is really great fortune for Kahn because George Mason is one of the most important architects in Detroit's history. He designed the Grand Hotel on Mackinac Island, as well as the Detroit Masonic Temple and a bunch of others. So having George Mason take you under his wing, it's setting you up for success later in life. While he's working at this office, in 1890, he wins a $500 scholarship from the American Architect and Building News. And in 1890, $500 finances an 11-month trip in Europe. And this is what he's expected to do. It's a stipulation of his scholarship that he travel Europe and he makes sketches of classical architecture in the old country. And these are the drawings that the University of Michigan has amassed through a very generous donation of Albert Kahn's descendants. And, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. But anyway, shortly after the trip, where he makes the vast majority of the drawings we're going to look at tonight, when he gets back, he's promoted to chief designer, and he keeps this job for about a half-decade more, up until 1896, when he sets out on his first corporate partnership with Nettleton, Kahn, and Trowbridge. Trowbridge leaves the next year to head the architecture department at, I think it was not Princeton, Cornell, at Cornell University. And he becomes Nettleton and Kahn for a couple years, and then Nettleton passes away at the age of 37 in 1900. So he actually reunites with Mason for 1 year in 1901 and forms the corporation of Mason and Kahn. And while that corporation is formed for that 1 year, he designs West Hall on the Diag at the University of Michigan, and also the Palms apartment building just east of downtown on East Jefferson Ave in Detroit. And these are his very first designs using reinforced concrete. And his use of reinforced concrete, it ends up being super revolutionary in the design of automotive production facilities in southeast Michigan, especially for the Packard plant, where he first makes designs in 1905, but they really start getting revolutionary around 1909. And the way that they use the reinforced concrete, it opens up the building so much more light and so much more space and so much more ventilation that he sets himself up as the preeminent designer of auto manufacturing facilities in the metro area, right at a time when the industry is absolutely exploding. And over the next 3 decades, he designs 3 plants. He designs many plants that are influential in the evolution of architectural design, but probably the most influential are these 3 we're looking at here. The Highland Park plant in Detroit in the 1910s, the River Rouge plant from the 1920s, and the Chrysler half-ton truck plant in Warren from the 1930s. And they have a very sparse, undecorated, unornamented appearance, very streamlined, and it resonates with a group of European architects known as the Modernists. And the most important of the Modernists is, without question, Walter Gropius, because he founds the Bauhaus School of Architecture in Weimar, Germany. And that ends up becoming one of the most important architectural schools in the history of architecture. And we can see from his Fagerswerk shoe factory in Elfeld, Germany, built right after the Highland Park plant, that he is definitely trying to emulate the look of the steel sash windows that Kahn uses so much on his factory designs of the era. The modernist ideas coalesce in the mid to late 20th century, and it develops into a style known as the International style. And this is a style of building epic and huge buildings that kind of proliferates all over the Western world over the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And we've got a lot of great examples right here in Detroit. The Allied Bank Tower, formerly known as Comerica Tower, right downtown, that's a Philip Johnson design. This glass tower you're looking at here is in Pittsburgh, and it's a little bit more historicist than international, but I bring Johnson into the discussion because he's one of the people that coins the term international style. Also in Dearborn, we've got the Ford World Headquarters building. It's a quintessential example of the international style, despite its use of color. And also working out of the Bloomfield area at this time is a guy by the name of Eero Saarinen, who designs the terminal at Dulles Airport in DC and the St. Louis Arch. And he's making international style designs that are being constructed all over the United States and Western Europe throughout his career. So Detroit, very well represented among the international style progenitors and practitioners. But I have to tell you that I am not the most qualified person to draw a straight line from Albert Kahn through the modernists and into the international style. There's much more seasoned academics that will tell the story in a way more eloquent fashion than I can in the little time we have here. And I want to recommend those books to you right now. The first one is Albert Kahn, Architect of Ford by Federico Bucci, first published in Italian in 1991, translated to English in 1993. And also in 2001, the University of Michigan Museum of Art, they have a retrospective of Kahn's life and career, and they produce a booklet to go along with it called Inspiration for the Modern. And there's essays by 4 different people in this book that just are really super well researched, eloquent, and make super convincing arguments for Albert Kahn's influence on subsequent generations of building designers. So, to me, what really makes Albert Kahn super unique in the grand pantheon of architecture is not only does he exert a pretty massive influence on the evolution of architectural design, he also exerts a pretty massive influence on the direction of world history. And this influence is best exemplified by three different factory projects we're going to look at here. The Willow Run Bobber plant in Ypsilanti, which is mostly torn down these days. These photos I was able to get in the years before they were torn down though. Also, the Chrysler Tank Arsenal in Warren, built 1940 to 43. Both of them are constructed in anticipation of the United States becoming more deeply involved in World War II. And when we hear the phrase arsenal of democracy, these two factories are the most literal representation of that phrase. The Willow Run plant creates bomber planes, and the Chrysler Tank Arsenal obviously creates tanks, and they create a lot. And Detroit at that time only has about 2% of the nation's population, but they produce about 10% of the munitions and war tools that we use throughout World War II. So not only does he produce these factories stateside, from 29 to 32, Kahn's company, they take on projects in the Soviet Union intended to draw the Soviets out of their agrarian economy and get them more industrialized. So they create and they train the Russians in the design of factories, and also over 500 factories get built to their designs over the coming years afterwards. Let's take a look at just a few of them. You'll get a sense of how epic these plants are. And they're originally designed to build tractors, but no one is really very surprised at all as the storm clouds of war gather in Europe that the Russians transform these factories into wartime production, and they produce an absolute ton of munitions. And for those of you who don't know, Russia's contribution to the World War II effort in terms of human life greatly exceeds any other nation on earth. The Russians give up 10 million people strictly to military conflict, and 10 million more in collateral damage. And that 20 million people represents 15% of their population at that point in history. The United States, by contrast, gives up approximately 500,000 people to the war effort. Not to discount our contribution, but the Russians, they give till it hurts, and again and again and again. And without the Russians, it's very easily arguable that the Nazi scourge is never fully vanquished in Europe, and that we might still see influences of Nazi rule in Europe to this day. So in my mind, these adaptive renovations applied to these plants are the most important renovations ever applied to any Kahn structures anywhere, because without them, it's questionable as to whether the war would have turned out the way it did. Their contribution is very frequently acknowledged in the Western press. Here we see a Free Press headline leading up to VE Day in April of 1945 that shows just how important Russia's contribution to the war effort is. So now let's get back to our original reason for being here tonight, folks, and that is to talk about Albert Kahn's visits to Europe between 1890 and 1927. Over the course of these 6 trips, he produces 276 drawings. There is evidence that he took another trip in the 30s, but he's concentrated mostly on taking photographs on that trip. But we're going to look at just his trips that involved making drawings in Europe. And if you folks want to look at the entire collection, you can go right to the University of Michigan Museum of Art's website. Jot down that website if you like. And when you get to that first page, it's real easy to find, ma'am. If you Google it, you'll find it in a heartbeat. I'll go back there, though, because it looks like you are. Oh, you're getting a picture there. Too slow? Tell me, I'll go back in a second. I just want to show you the opening page, though. That's just 4 of the drawings you'll see, but there's many, many more. You ready? Yeah, you're welcome. So Kahn's trip to Europe is acknowledged in local and national press. The American Architect and Building News is actually a Boston-based publication at this time, and they talk about Kahn's departure date of December 6th. They also mention a guy in here lower in the text by the name of Mr. Bacon. You guys, right there, Mr. Bacon. Mr. Bacon, he gets a different scholarship called the Roch Scholarship. And he's actually Henry Bacon, who ends up being the designer of the Lincoln Memorial on the Washington Mall in D.C. And they're both in Europe at the same time, and they end up traveling together for 4 months, which is kind of an interesting little twist. clipping on the right, there's a lot to read there, but that's basically a citizen of Detroit talking about how he's gone to see one of these shows where Kahn has displayed his drawings after he comes back from Europe, which he does many times over the next few years, and they're really, really well received by the public, and I think you guys will be impressed by them too. So let's look at his 1890 to 1891 itinerary. He departs the United States on December 6th, arrives in England on the 15th. Not much is known about what he does in Europe from December 16th to March 22nd. There is no sketch record that has dates on it to tell us where he is. Me and some other Albert Kahn scholars, we theorize that maybe some of the descendants still possess them and just haven't made that known to the public. His first place that he visits is Venice, Italy, and he stays in Italy for about 1 month. Then he moves on to France, and he stays in France from about May 1st to June 20th. Echternach is interesting because this is a place where he spent 6 years growing up, and it's bookended by no drawings on either side, so we speculate that he's probably spending time with a family at that point and not spending a lot of time on drawing. In July, he heads to Germany. He stays there for about a half a month, and I love pointing out that he has a signed drawing with date July 15th in Munich, Germany, and he has a signed drawing with date July 16th in Verona, Italy, which paints all kinds of romanticized visions of him taking a midnight train through the Alps from southern Germany to northern Italy, which I think any of us would love to do sometime. Anyway, he's back to Germany again by July 22nd. He hangs out there for about another 2 weeks, does about 2.5 weeks in Belgium, over 9 cities, and then he spends the remainder of his time in Europe over 25 different cities and villages in France, which becomes pretty apparent as his favorite place to visit when he goes to Europe. And he comes back to the United States. Well, he departs November 17th. So let's take just a little bit of a sidetrack here to look at the comparison between Angel Hall on the campus of the University of Michigan, designed by Albert Kahn, and the Lincoln Memorial on the National Mall. Many people believe that Kahn's design for Angel Hall is in fact an homage to Henry Bacon, and I think that when you analyze these buildings side by side, that becomes quite apparent, especially in the tapering and the finish of the columns. They're almost identical. But interestingly, they both use architectural sculptors that come out of the same New York City scene that Parducci also came out of. So a lot of really great similarities there, in my personal opinion. Let's look at his remaining itineraries on trips on which he made drawings. In 1911 and 1912, he visits 8 Italian cities, as well as 1 in Portugal and 1 in Spain. In October of 1920, he visits London, England, and he makes only 3 drawings in the Kensington Museum. In 1924, he visits 2 cities in France, 7 in Italy. In October of 25, he visits 7 in France, and in 1927, he visits 4 cities in Spain. We're going to cover at least 1 site from every one of those trips, except for the England trip, because the quality of the drawings and the fact that they're so few, it really has led me to believe over the years that Kahn was not as interested in making drawings on this trip as he was others. And let's just take a little map of every place that we're going to visit in Europe tonight. And I'm going to go quick. I put a lot of info in my lectures, so don't mind me if I motor mouth it. So let's start off in Italy, and we're going to start off in Venice. Who's been to the Piazza San Marco? All right, good. A lot of world travelers here. This happens to be the only location in Kahn's drawing collection that I have visited. I learned about Kahn's drawing after I took my only European vacation in 2016, and I'm kind of bummed about that because I would have went to a lot more of these sites if I had known about this drawing collection. But I am glad that I got at least 1 site that Kahn visited, and he does quite a bit here. Now, when you go inside the church, it's unbelievably ornately decorated. So there's a lot of really small details that Kahn draws that you just can't find from a photo record online. But the place is so amazingly famous, and there's so many photos, and the proliferation of photography online, it really surprises you sometimes, the small details where you can find a comparison. These door knockers, when I first saw them, I'm like, I'm never going to be able to find a match for that. Wrong. They're super famous. They're right on the front doors. And there's a ton of photos available of them online. And the one there right in the middle is probably an exact match to the one on the far right, although it looks like the tip of the nose has been recast in recent centuries. Right next door to St. Mark's Basilica is the Doge's Palace, and this faces the river, and this is pretty much the quintessence of Venetian-style architecture that's so often copied by like Vegas casino builders and such. And Kahn also spends a lot of time inside the Doge's Palace, which is built in the 14th and 15th century. It's been a state-owned museum since 1923. And again, a lot of these details are so small that you can't possibly hope to find a photo match for it online. This one on the lower left, for example, is a door lock plate. But if you go looking deep enough at Kahn's drawing collection, you'll find that he sketches some of the most important parts of the Doge's Palace, including the Veronese ceiling, which has paintings in its openings by a guy named Paolo Veronese, created in the 16th century. But Kahn, he doesn't try to emulate any of the painting, thankfully. He just sticks to the sculptural architectural details, which is his passion. He loves sketching things that have great 3D embellishments. And if you look real closely, you'll see that there is, in fact, an octagonal long window there. There's an ovular window. It is an exact match to Kahn's ceiling drawing here. Looking deeper inside the Doge's Palace, we'll find a decorative fireplace that doesn't really host fires anymore, but it sure looks good, doesn't it? Kahn sketches it on his 1891 trip. And also, we get a little peek at a place called the Giant Staircase. Kahn calls it Giant Stair, Venice, on his sketch there. What is the Giant Staircase? Well, that's the Giant Staircase. And the part that Kahn is sketching is just this little area right here. Yeah. Yep, just that little newel post and where the banister meets it. So Kahn is really into small details like that. And you don't, well, maybe sometimes, but not super frequently will you get the full structure. Usually it concentrates on detail. Another really great feature of Venice is the wells. And I was like, a well, just a random old well somewhere? How am I going to find that? Well, it turns out there's a lot of people go to Venice, and they'll set up an itinerary just to go out and find wells because they're really cool and they're really old. And Kahn leaves us a clue near San Giovanni and Paula. What is San Giovanni and Paula? It is St. John and Paul, a really famous church that you're going to see in just a second. But sure enough, I was able to find an amazing Wikipedia Commons photo where we can see it has the exact same inscription at the base, and it's even got that little black cutout there where the pump used to be. You can see in the Kahn drawing. This is right next to a massive and beautiful church named San Giovanni and Paula, St. John and Paul in English. And if you look really closely here, oops, I'm going to try not to break this, we'll see that well is right there. See it? Maybe I should, I don't know if this pushes up at all, but I think I'll just leave it. I'll just squeeze around it. So another really great example, though. Let's move on to Verona, Italy, the famous town where Romeo and Juliet took place. And we're going to look at a destination known as Torre de Lamberti, or Lamberti Tower. Like so many European structures, ancient European structures, it has an insanely complex construction history. Generally speaking, as a professional architectural historian, that doesn't bother me too much because I'm almost always concentrating on American stuff, and I can find a great newspaper record that gives me all the details. It doesn't work that way when you're an American studying Europe from afar, especially if you don't speak the European languages, because that's what the old newspapers are going to be in. And also, you have to go buy a whole different archive. So I've pieced together my histories from doing deep internet research and coming up with consensuses. But I will confess to you right now that my architectural research on European sites is not quite as exacting as my research on Detroit and United States sites. Anyway, that statement goes for a lot of these European buildings that have extremely complex construction histories that we can't get all the way into because it's too detailed. Anyway, just to give you an idea of this building's the complexity of the construction history, it lasts from the 12th century to the 18th century. It's named for a royal family that apparently has died out since then. There's a website you can go and visit their see what they have to offer. You'll find some additional photos of the tower there, and we can see that it is an exact match to what Kahn has created, although sketched from a different angle by Kahn. But just to underscore the point I was making to you earlier about the difficulty of researching European destinations online, I've found out throughout my history as an architectural historian that it's not at all uncommon for myself doing deep research to end up with a knowledge that exceeds people that work at the actual place I'm studying. And here's just one really simple example, and I'm not trying to be overly critical, but these are the kind of things you got to try to figure out later. One page on their website says the clock's added 1798. Another page says it's added in 1779. And this is on the same website, presumably written by the same people. So I didn't come to an actual conclusion about which one of those is accurate, but these are the kind of things that you run into when you're trying to do your research based on websites rather than newspaper archives. But what their website does offer in terms of photographs are great. We get an interior view of the spiral staircase and also a view of Verona from their bell tower. Despite all these beautiful details, though, the most famous thing about this tower is that it's a 2 minutes walk from Juliet's balcony. Juliet's balcony is actually built in 1900 as a tourist destination because the people of the town know how famous the play is. And they want to get people into town and pay a few dollars to get their picture taken up on the balcony there. So it's not true to the story. It didn't exist in Shakespeare's time, but it definitely is a super popular tourist site. Let's move on to France now. How about you give me the pronunciation there, sir?
Which one?
Borges? Bourges. Okay, Bourges. That's the first time I've ever heard it pronounced. So I've been calling it Bourges in my head for quite a few years now. In Bourges, we have a very small, originally built as a residence known as La Maison de la Reine Blanche. I'm probably not pronouncing it very well. Hope you'll forgive me. That's the House of the White Queen in English. And this is in a really old section of the city that has really thin streets. Luckily, Kahn leaves us that clue with the name that the locals call the place. And if you look real closely on the left side of that street, you'll see it. It's the wood second structure there. It's the wood one. But the street is so thin that it's hard to get a Google street view of it. And we can see when we look closely at the Google Street View that some wood embellishments have been added since Kahn's time. So Google, maybe not that great for getting a photo record, but it's a pretty famous place that is now a military surplus store. I thought those were only popular in the United States, but apparently the French like them too. But this is really popular with the locals and architectural history enthusiasts in general, so you can find quite a few photos at other websites. And this building features architectural sculpture in wood that's been there since, I think it was the 14th century. And when wood lasts that long, it certainly takes on damage. Some pieces age better than others. But to see something built in that material that's lasted this long, it usually fascinates me because wood rots so easily. Kind of feel the same way about wood headstones at cemeteries, which you run into periodically and are often astounded by how long it has lasted. We're going to move to Frankfurt, Germany now. Anybody been? Oh, go ahead, ma'am.
I just have a question. Do you know what kind of wood they were carved from that it lasted so long?
I can't answer about types of wood, but I can tell you there are quite a few different applications that you can make on wood to get it to last much longer. Now, I don't know much about those techniques except to say that they exist and that by properly treating wood, you can get a few more centuries out of it for sure. A really great local example for anybody who's curious, go downtown to St. Peter and Paul. It's pretty much the oldest standing church in Detroit. They have a wood tympanum over their front door that probably dates to about 1850, and it's surprisingly great looking, and you'll see that it's really super lacquered, and that's probably one of the reasons that it's lasted so long. So in downtown Frankfurt, they have a little section of town called Romerberg. It's right in the center of a super modern downtown. Anybody been to it before? All right, we got a couple of Romerberg visitors. So you guys are not going to be surprised by how fancy the buildings are here. Here are Kahn's sketches. He makes two on July 5th, 1891. But when I went looking around for photos of Romerberg online, I couldn't find these buildings to save my life. Anybody got any speculations as to where they went? Bombed, exactly. And we're going to look at a few sites like that tonight that have changed drastically because of what happened during World War II. So let's get just a couple more views of the Romer. This building in the center, the pink one, that is actually called the Romer, and it was a government building, and it is the reason for the name of the neighborhood. That building was actually completely destroyed in World War II and rebuilt on a simplified level in 1955. And if we look at the drawings again, and we think about the fact that we can't find these buildings, how are we supposed to know that this is actually where Kahn is? Well, how about the Justice Fountain right in the middle of the square and those little finials on the fence there? You see how they correspond exactly to Kahn's drawing, which clues us into the fact that he's definitely on these blocks while he's making these drawings. So why aren't the buildings there? Well, this old postcard of the Romer and the two buildings next to us give us a clue. It looks like those two buildings were most likely destroyed, and much more modern buildings were put there in their stead. And this is what clued me into the fact that the reason I spent an hour traveling around Frankfurt on Google Maps not being able to find them is because they almost certainly got destroyed by bombs in World War II. Moving on to another town greatly affected by World War II, Nuremberg, Germany. We have what's called the Nassauer House. It's got a great local name that the Germans call it, but I'm not going to try to say it. It's got there's a lot of letters in there, isn't it? So there's all kinds of complex building history on this one also, built from the 13th to 20th century. Some of the turrets are damaged by bombing during World War II and rebuilt in 1950 to 1954. Let's compare Kahn's drawing to its present-day appearance, though. Their reconstructions are extremely true to the original, and probably you can barely recognize a difference. I love it when I come across historical photographs and old paintings, especially that show these buildings in their historical state. And again, Kahn, he seems to capture the essence of this place in his drawing, albeit incomplete. Let's move on to Belgium now, and the first town we're going to visit in Belgium is called Leuven. I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, I apologize. Leuven has an amazing city hall that is extremely, extremely ornate in its architectural sculpture. It's a style known as Brabantine Gothic. The town hall, other buildings in that style include the Brussels Town Hall, another cathedral in Belgium, a pretty big cathedral in the Netherlands there. Let's get a real picture of it, though, just to give you an idea of how ornate this building is. I even got a nice night shot here. That's from the other side, because you'll notice that one of the corner towers is not decorated in sculpture for whatever reason. It's kind of an interesting asymmetrical feature there. We'll get real close up and we'll see exactly how much sculpture is on this bad boy, and it's a lot. And I'm a lover of architectural sculpture, so even though I've never visited this building, I've definitely fallen in love with it. Aalst, Belgium. This is called the Scheppenhuis, or Belfort van Aalst. It is a belfry-style construction that is kind of common in northern France and Belgium at that time. And it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site that is shared by 50 other sites of buildings that have famous belfries. Another super, super complex construction history that culminates with a partial building and partial rebuilding, partial burning and partial rebuilding in 1879. Probably the biggest difference we're going to notice between Kahn's drawing and its present appearance is, in fact, the clock on the tower. Remind you once again, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. But check out this comparison with this 1880 painting by Gustav Walkiers. If we look at this area of the structure right here, you see how different it is here? So this leads me to believe that Walkiers actually executed this painting probably in the years before 1879, before that last burning and rebuilding happened. So this gives us an idea of its appearance just before then. Can't really account for the misdating of the painting, but not too far off. That's my theory. Probably accurate, but hard to say for 100% certain. All right, let's move on to l'Escalier de la Reine Berthe in Chartres, France, which is one of my favorite discoveries. over the course of my research for my upcoming book, and I love this drawing so much that it's going to go on the cover. And I'm really excited about this. This is built circa 1500. It's been a historical monument in France since 1899. I don't know what it takes to get that designation, though. But I think you'll agree with me when we compare them side by side that Kahn has greatly romanticized this building, and he has fit it into his 20th century vision of perfect 90-degree angles and such. And that doesn't bother me because Kahn's version, it shows all the wood detail that a camera just can't capture when it's got all that light space right next to the wood. So he really gets in deep, and he produces quite a detailed rendition of the many pieces of wood architectural sculpture that we're going to see here in just a second. This is a photo from 1973 when a building right next to it was demolished, allowing this perspective to be shot that you will find hardly anywhere else. And here is some of this ancient wood sculpture I've referred to, again in pretty good shape considering it's been there since about 1500. Let's move on to Chartres now. And this is Chartres Cathedral, which is one of the most important cathedrals in Europe and rivals Notre Dame of Paris in terms of beauty. It is revered by architectural historians worldwide. It's also another UNESCO World Heritage Site, built from the 12th to 13th century in the French Gothic and Romanesque style. An absolutely beautiful a cathedral that I wish I had known more about before I visited Europe, because I definitely would have stopped here, because between my trip in 2016 and now, I've developed a huge love for photographing stained glass, and Chartres Cathedral has some of the most dramatic stained glass in all of Europe that dates also to the 12th century. Kahn, though, stained glass isn't his thing. He's into architectural sculpture, and Chartres Cathedral has some of the best. Forgive me for pronouncing it Chartres. I hang out in New Orleans a lot, and we call Chartres Street Chartres Streets. So we get a perfect match here to one of Kahn's drawings. And these royal-looking figures in these very super horizontal rows. There's probably like 10 different spots on the church that have that style of architectural sculpture, and it was always thrilled to be able to find an exact match when I was doing this research. Here's a place I had never heard of before I was turned on to Kahn's drawing, and it's probably going to go on my destinations next time I visit Europe. This is in a very small town, Azay-le-Rideau, and it's called the Chateau d'Azay-le-Rideau. And this is a rich person's chalet. I don't know, chalet is probably not the right word. French chateau-esque structure that's built on an island in the middle of a river. And like so many of the ornate structures that Kahn draws over his trips in Europe, well, it's a huge tourist site now. So there's a great photo record of it online where you can learn all about this building and its history. You can find out about who lived here originally. It was a French government administrator of some sort, if I'm not mistaken, and his wife was known to live here more frequently than he did. Also, this website includes some great photos of the interior of the roof and tells the story of how one of the French kings had to give permission for the timbers to be felled to create this roof. So that's an interesting wrinkle in the historical story. And Chateau d'Azay-le-Rideau has been run as a national park by the National Monument Center of France since 1905. All right, one more shot here because we get a perfect match. The pinnacle up there is this exact spot that Kahn has drawn here. And this one and the first one we saw in the Azay-le-Rideau series, they're duplicated over on the right, because a lot of times these broadcast screens sometimes don't show as much detail as they should. Check out my drawings if you have a greater curiosity. We're going to move on now to I always want to say Cannes, but everybody's like, oh, you mean where they have the film festival? No, they have a slightly different pronunciation that only French people can hear.
Cool.
Okay, all right. So I'm going to take your word for it. Con?
Cool.
Con. All right. You remind me of my friend Quentin, who lived with me here in the Detroit area for a couple of years back in the early 2000s. And anytime I tried to pronounce anything in French, he'd get this completely judgmental look in his eyes. Because if you're not from France, you're doing it wrong. So in Caen, he visits a church known as Église Saint-Pierre, and this is kind of an amazing discovery for me because this is a super ornate church that you think more Americans would know about on the level that they know about Notre Dame and Chartres Cathedral, because it is really elaborate with architectural sculpture. Kahn makes 6 drawings here over the course of 3 days, which is indicative of how much he must have loved the place. But because it's more obscure and not as well known as some other famous cathedrals, the photo record of this one is not as great online, so I'm not as able to make as great of comparisons. So Kahn also chooses to not sketch the steeple here, leading me to speculate that maybe, possibly it hadn't been built by that point, but I bet it was, and he just chose to skip it for whatever reason. But we do get some close matches, not exact matches, and the photos that I borrowed for the sake of my lecture, they're kind of low resolution also. But this gargoyle is very similar. It's got a wing there about mid-length, and it's got a turned face, and there's probably about 12 of these on this church. We also get a lot of pendant keys hanging from the ceiling. Pretty close match here, but I can't blow up that photo any bigger to prove it because it gets fractalized because it's got such a low resolution. But I was able to come up with one exact match here, and it's kind of close. Okay, this area right here. Am I doing it right? Yeah, that's this guy right here where it's this. So we do have one little exact match there. But if I had more time to look into it, I'm sure we could find a few more online. It's also a matter of what kind of website you're borrowing from, and some it's more appropriate than others. Wikipedia Commons especially. Did you have a question? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I saw you raise your hand. So we're going to move on to a second place in Caen. Here it's called the Vestiges de l'Ancienne Église Saint-Gilles. And why are we only looking at vestiges? Because it got bombed. Yep, we got a great historic record here though, so we can see how it originally appears. Here's a little bit of a close-up, and let you look at the Kahn drawing again. So let's go back to the historical drawing. Right there in the center, you see that exact same arch there. This is what it looks like today. It's one of those churches that the French decided not to rebuild after World War II, but instead make it a monument to the history of the war. And this still stands here just like it is to this day. If we make a close comparison, we'll see in this inner shaded arch there on the far right, it does in fact match this spot right here. But if you're not convinced like that, we can get a historical image that's even more convincing there. And it looks like there may have been some changes applied to the church sometime in between when this photo was taken and when Kahn made his drawing, because the inner door there's got curves on the top in the second drawing. But other than that, it's a perfect match, including this really unique, oddly placed gargoyle here that's completely asymmetrical and really makes you wonder, why did they feel the need to put that there? Must have had to channel some water from someplace. So that concludes the 1891 trip. We're going to step forward in time now to 1911 and 1912 when Kahn visits Europe and visits 8 Italian cities, one in Portugal and one in Spain. We're going to stick strictly to Italy, and we're going to go to Florence, which was one of my favorite downtowns when I visited Italy. In Florence, Kahn visits a place called the Abbazia di San Miniato al Monte. And this is a really beautiful Romanesque, old Romanesque church built in the 11th century, kind of on a hilltop on the outskirts of town. So you get a really lovely view of Florence looking from this site. Another place I wish I would have visited when I was in Europe, but I just didn't know about it. It's got a sumptuous interior, and it features a little bit of Della Robbia's sculpture, who happens to be one of my all-time favorite architectural sculptors. And if you're not familiar with the Della Robbia family, I did bring a book with me tonight over by the Prince. Do you have a question there, young man?
Yeah, it was about Florence, and I know that Florence was a place where Dante lived.
Dante Alighieri, that's right. And he's a pretty important figure from Italian history also. I think Dante precedes the Renaissance, though, but I can't remember what era he's from. But you do have a great knowledge of books there, young man. Not many kids your age bringing up the Inferno, which was one of his most famous books. Thanks for the extra info. So despite the fact that the building has a sumptuous interior, Kahn oddly decides to concentrate on the marble inlaid floor installed in the 12th century. And you can see we have some exact matches in the pattern work there. And let's move on to our next site, which is in Bologna, Italy. And he visits here on January 20th, 1912. This is one of my favorite sites I discovered over the course of my research. This is the Basilica di Santo Stefano, and it has got another unbelievably complex construction history. There's multiple buildings here. I'm not going to make you guys suffer through every detail of the construction here, but we are going to focus on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, supposedly built in the 5th century, but it's by tradition. There really isn't written records to prove that. And then the courtyard of Palati that is created in the 13th century. And why are those more important than the other places? Because this is where Kahn makes all of his drawings from. Here is the courtyard of Palati we're in, facing right at the church. And let's compare it to Kahn's drawing. Well, definitely a 100% exact match. And for greater measure, he even moves to his left a little bit and faces the colonnade and gets the well in that courtyard also. One of the coolest things about this collection of Kahn drawings is he does one in color. And we get some really great exact matches here in the brickwork. Another place that I really wish I would have visited on my European itinerary, but maybe the next time around. Moving on to 1924 now. We're going to look at Albert Kahn in 2 cities in France, 7 in Italy. We're actually going to go to Paris in this one. And Kahn actually visited Paris in 1891 and spent a ton of time there. But he spent a ton of time in the Cluny Museum. And in the Cluny Museum, he creates tons and tons of detail drawings. But he doesn't do much from the outside until the 1924 trip. This is built in the late 15th century. By a private citizen who's also an art collector, and when he passes away, the French government takes it over and eventually turns it into a museum. It was originally the Hotel de Cluny. And we can see the exact angle from which Kahn sketches. The roof, the peaked roof there, unfortunately, is cut off in the photograph. The gabled window there definitely proves it's the same spot, as does the arch to the left. Also, we have an undated sketch, most likely from 1924, but possibly from 1891, of the bigger arch there. And what I really loved about the arch is that my man, Eugene Agay, he photographed it in about 1900. And this is one of the most famous photographers in photography history. He was famous for photographing daily scenes in the French streets throughout the late parts of the 1800s and early 1900s, which is a very, very early date to be amassing a huge catalog of photography. So as a professional architectural historian and professional photographer, I love that I'm able to produce this comparison here for you folks. Let's look at just a few details that Kahn makes at the Cluny Museum in Paris in 1891. This is all interior stuff, and the Cluny, they don't have a big selection of their collection online for viewing, so I was not able to make any comparisons there. But interesting that he chose to visit it twice over the course of a few trips. He doesn't always do that. We're going to move on to Rome, Italy now, and we're going to look at a church called Santa Maria in Cosmedin. This is built from the 7th to 12th century in the Romanesque style, again, of super complex construction history. We can see that Kahn is extremely true to the building in his rendering, although it looks like between when Kahn drew it and now that the clock was removed from the tower. And whoever reconstructed the columns on that floor of the tower did an excellent job. You can barely notice. This building's gone through quite a few refacings over the course of its life. From 1718 to 1894, it was redesigned in a Baroque fashion by a pretty well-known Italian architect of the time by the name of Giuseppe Sardi. And they switched it back in 1894. You can tell how old this place is in the interior. And it's got another really cool interior feature. Who has seen Roman Holiday starring Gregory Peck and Audrey Hepburn? In this movie, Gregory Peck and Audrey Hepburn, they visit the church and they put their hands in the mouth of truth. And if you tell a lie while your hand is in the mouth of truth, it bites you. So I'm sure this probably has something to do with their wedding, promises or whatever. But really very cool to see it used, this architectural feature used in a classic American film. This slab of marble was originally a sewer cover in Italy, believe it or not. Yeah, they were pretty elaborate with them back then, weren't they? Moving on to 1925 now, we're getting close to our conclusion here, folks. We're going to visit Vézelay, France. Who knows if I'm pronouncing that one correctly? Do you get any word on that one?
Vézelay.
Vézelay, very good. Man, it sounds like you said you spent 5 years there, eh?
I worked in France for 5 years.
All right.
Europe totally for about 20.
I think that my friend Quentin would be impressed with your accent, actually. What's that? There was a thank you in there, I think. I heard that part. So in Vézelay, he sketches the Basilica of St. Mary Magdalene of Vézelay, built in the 12th century in the Burgundian Romanesque style. And if we compare it to the front, we'll see that this tower is not exactly the same. It's actually because this is one of the rear towers, which I was not able to find as good a photo of. And I probably wouldn't have wanted to use it anyway because the facade of this building is so lovely, and I wanted to include that. Another UNESCO World Heritage Site inscribed in, I can't remember what year it got. It's 1979. And this building is super, super famous for its history because St. Bernard, the St. Bernard, actually preached the Second Crusade here. I'm not sure what it means to preach the Second Crusade other than he probably endorsed it, which might not be the greatest thing by today's standards, but back then he was considered a huge hero. Richard the Lionhearted and Philip II also met here right before they departed for the Third Crusade. So wildly historic. But among architectural historians, it's loved mostly for its architectural sculpture, which is super, super unique early examples in really dynamic, interesting, unexpected forms of human anatomy. And Kahn, he is totally clued into the fact that this is why this church is so famous to people like himself who sketch classical architecture, and he picks out its most famous parts to sketch. This arch, while beautiful, is a little bit less famous than this tympanum here, which separates the narthex from the nave. And this tympanum is analyzed very, very frequently in art history because Christ appears to be dancing. He's much more animated and much more active than the way Christ is usually portrayed in architectural sculpture of this era. But let's not forget the full interior too, because again, a really, really beautiful and ancient church. We're going to hit our last site now, and our last site is going to be in Spain, in the town of Ronda. Anybody been to Ronda? Oh, not a single Ronda visitor, huh? That surprises me because, we got one right here?
We've been to Granada.
Granada, okay. Well, we're going to cover Ronda tonight, and I'm surprised no one's been to Ronda because this bridge right here is actually a super, super famous tourist site. Ronda exists on two sides of a gorge, and for many centuries there was a lower bridge that you could only cross by foot. And then in the 18th century they built this higher bridge. And if we take a really close look at the far photo there and how much brickwork they built all the way from the bottom, really seems like they've overdone it, doesn't it? Like, I mean, this bridge is stronger than it needs to be. Why might that be? Oh, well, their first attempt at a new bridge a couple decades earlier collapsed 6 years after its construction and killed 50 locals. So when they went to redo it, they're like, we're not getting it wrong this time. And I really love the brick massing because down here at the bottom, they actually quarried some of it from a nearby area. And some of the rocks towards the bottom get to be almost the exact same color as the rocks that they're embedded in them. And it really gives you this feeling that like the bridge is growing out of the gorge more than it was built. So also on the right here, I'm going to show you one little thing here. Barely see it right there. There's the old bridge. So significantly more difficult crossing there, that you got to take some paths down and then some paths back up. And maybe you can take a donkey and a bray, but you can't take a car, and you can't take a covered wagon. So that's my last entry, folks, and that concludes my lecture. I hope you've enjoyed what you've learned tonight. I just want to remind you again that I am the author of Kahn's Detroit, and I have it available for sale tonight at a $5 discount from the cover price. But if you prefer to support a local retailer, it's available quite a few places locally on Amazon.com. And I do sell all of my books at Dale-A-Carlson.square site. And that's where I personally get the best payoff. So if you guys decide to purchase somewhere other than from me directly tonight, please head to that website. Thanks so much for your time, folks. I really hope you've enjoyed it.